t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'as fait manquer, Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'as préféré, Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime.
Hello and welcome to Brussels, my love, our weekly talk show from the heart of Europe. I'm Stefan Grobe. Coming up today, at the COP29 climate conference in Baku, frustration was all over. Observers and delegates have been disappointed at the slow pace of progress. No clarity on climate financing or how vulnerable countries can access the funding, to name just one issue. And then there were the fossil fuel giants casting a shadow over the summit. Has the COP process run its course? And bye-bye green transition? Statements by politicians from around the globe seem to suggest that reports of an untimely death of traditional energy sources were premature. And with Donald Trump at the helm again, all the progress of the Biden administration is poised to be undone. Will fossil fuels stage a comeback? And what does that mean for us in Europe? Questions for our panel today. Sam Williams, EU Policy Manager at the Energy and Climate Policy and Innovation Council. Susanna Karp, Deputy Executive Director of Clean Tech for Europe. And Franziska Heckel, Policy Researcher at Safe Soil. Thank you again for joining us here on the set. Now, before we jump right into it, let's take a look at the state of climate affairs in Baku.
After almost 2 weeks of COP29 in Baku, there was none of the chaos of Copenhagen and none of the long queues under a scorching sun like in Dubai. That's about it for the good news. While the UN climate talks have made significant progress over the past decade, the current COP process seems unable to make changes happen quickly or force countries to act, many experts say. Example, the president of the host country Azerbaijan told the conference that natural gas was a gift from God and that it's perfectly legit to bring it to market. So much for climate ambition. In the meantime, since COP28 last year, emissions of warming gases have increased once again, up by almost 1%. Yet, scientists say these emissions need to fall by more than 40% by the end of this decade to avoid a really dangerous impact on nature. Maybe the COP process needs serious reform.
Susanna, I want to start with you. There's obviously a lot to unpack here, but does the whole COP process need reform? Apparently, it's not churning out policy proposals that would be helpful to save the climate.
Well, so first of all, this COP has had multiple pillars, and we shouldn't forget that it actually started with a success story, which was that there was finally agreement on Article 6.4, which means that since the Clean Development Mechanism, we will have a UN body process certifying projects as of January and generating credits. And the reason this is important is because many of the previous COPs were actually criticized for being unsuccessful due to the lack of progress on Article 6. And now it's quite interesting to see we started with good news on Article 6, but it's what has been unfolding ever since that makes this COP indeed raise a question mark over the whole process. So what I would say is let's learn from what has worked for Article 6, which is that they took the technical discussions to a supervisory body where they had regional representation, but not all member states were involved. So they had delegated power to a regional representative, and that's how they could agree on progress. Maybe this is a model that we can build on in the future.
That sounds awfully technical, diplomatically speaking. Sam, reform of COP, what comes to mind?
I think the real issue here is not a mere presence of the 1,700 plus fossil fuels lobbyists. Everyone needs to be involved in the transition, and fossil fuels more than ever. Companies need to invest, divert money elsewhere. But the real problem there is that you don't have inclusivity. When you couple so many lobbyists from fossil fuels with the absence of leaders such as US, China, von der Leyen didn't go, when you have in the family picture, in the family photo of COP, you had 8 women out of 78 world leaders. When you have a lower kind of ambition from the side of countries like Saudi Arabia, who said that they would not recommit to transition away from fossil fuels. That is the issues. We need more representations also from small island nations and from nations that are most affected from climate change.
Yeah, well, obviously the COP thing is an event hosted by the United Nations, and UN things always go very slowly. Franziska, he mentioned this more than 1,700 lobbyists. Were they there for their expertise or for their goodwill? What happened?
So first of all, we have to keep in mind that the COP processes are always incremental processes, right? So they take time, and we cannot expect like within 2 weeks that all the problems are solved. And what we've seen at this COP, that already the slogan is pointing towards in solidarity for a green world, right? So here we have a focus as well on nature-based solutions and because it doesn't say the green world doesn't mean we paint the world green, right? It means we bring more trees, we bring more leaves and vegetation. And for that, the basis is soil. So this is a focus point which has been at COP, and this is something which is very good. The focus on nature-based solution is very much needed. And within the COP processes, we have different stakeholders. So people have different opinions and come together. But it is very important discussions that are happening, and definitely also it is very important that it's discussed about nature-based solutions and that they're also on the forefront of discussions.
I mean, we're not in this town in Brussels full of lobbyists, so we're used to them. But having so many of them at the climate conference was a bit surprising to me, Susanna. Is that the rule? Have they been in Dubai, in Sharm el-Sheikh, etc.?
Actually, they nearly always outnumber, let's say, the representatives of either NGOs or civil society movements, because actually participation in COP is expensive. And even when it comes to innovators and so SMEs, they rarely afford to go to COP. And in particular, this COP has been extremely expensive because also the Azeri government, or maybe just the market for accommodation in Baku, but it has increased the prices for accommodation times 10, right? And so who can afford to still go in those conditions? I actually know of other negotiations that have occurred with representatives of certain countries outside of the COP, simply because they couldn't afford to go to Baku in these conditions. Now, I do want to add the fact that this has been a geopolitical COP from the start. Let's not forget it was meant to actually take place in Bulgaria. Bulgaria had pitched for it, but that there were tensions inside the East European bloc, as it's called, inside the UNFCCC regional split. And so from the moment that, let's say, the hosting of the COP had gone to Azerbaijan, we already knew that this had been, a choice that was going to come with, an oil and gas country hosting the COP. So, of course, what does it mean for this sector? And then it was going to come with a certain aspect of the regional tensions in Central and Eastern Europe. And Sam, you mentioned that President von der Leyen was not at COP, but it's important to know that she was actually in Brazil at the G20 meeting, and Brazil is the next host of COP30. Right. So what we're seeing is leaders are pitching for the next COP already to be the big COP.
Well, that was kind of a competitive event, right? I mean, the big leaders were all in Brazil and not in Azerbaijan. Does that tell us something about the importance of COP? That it's not a top priority, Sam?
Well, again, it's about inclusivity, right? If it's super important, and I agree with Guterres when he mentioned that it's G20 leaders the countries represented in the G20 that emits 80% of greenhouse gases. But then if you have those discussions only in such formats, then you exclude, countries that are most affected from climate change and from those decisions that needs to be taken into consideration, such as, for example, small island nations. And this...
No, go ahead. And I just because this is a key word, and you mentioned solidarity earlier. So there are some countries that are more affected than others. And if you want to ask about the productive outcome of COP29, it very much depends on who you ask, right? Now, the foreign minister of Papua New Guinea, for example, has a very straightforward opinion. He said, and I quote, Papua New Guinea will no longer tolerate empty promises and inaction. COP meetings have gone around in circles, producing no tangible results. It's a total waste of time. Francisca, there's a lot of frustration in that answer, and Papua New Guinea is not a small island. It's a relatively big country in the Pacific, north of Australia. Do you share his frustration? Do you understand him?
So we definitely need tangible results. If we continue like this, we need things that we can achieve. And if we look into the issue that we have with soils at the moment, actually 40% of the soils are already degraded. And a new data from the Safe Soil Movement shows that if we don't address soil degradation, and if we continue like we're doing now, actually what soils will do is release carbon instead of what they could actually do be a carbon sink. And if this happens to only 1% of the agricultural soils in Europe, it would be equal to the emissions of 1 billion cars in the time span of 1 year. And that's a very high number. So we definitely have to prevent that. And we have to have tangible targets for that in order to prevent this from happening and to have a livable future.
Yeah,
Yes.
targets are always nice at conferences like this, right? But then when it comes to implementation and accomplishing keeping the promises, it's different.
Stefan, I want to try to respond to your question on is COP, let's say, phasing out of its importance? And my answer is absolutely not, because, and that's why I started with the positive story of having an agreement on Article 6, which previous COPs couldn't achieve. Don't forget that actually the multilateral process is what is underpinning the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is still the best bet we've got to avoid the worst consequences of climate change on the world population. And so we cannot give up on the COP process as such. However, I do believe there are actors and forces interested in undermining the COP process, and this was perhaps visible, in the lead up to the COP, also in some of the declarations made at COP, where leaders of certain countries were picked on, and this is not how you actually build a cooperative environment to reach an agreement. So there is a question there: whose interests does it serve if this COP is considered a failure, and if other COPs are actually then treated as failures because of this one? And I can tell you right now that it does not serve the interest of the majority of the population on this planet for the COP multilateral process to decrease in its importance. And so what I think happened in Brazil is not that there is a competition to show that COP is actually losing its importance. It's the world leaders pitching for the next COP to actually make up for whatever this one won't be able to achieve, exactly because humanity can't afford to give up on COP.
Sam, your thoughts on this?
I can fully agree. We cannot afford to go back, especially on the Paris Agreement. We have to keep on the messaging that we've been sharing for the last few years. Taking a step back, what is politics for? It's to provide targets, messaging, to provide certainty, to provide a direction for the market to then eventually deliver on that, right? And it has also a role for implementation. That is why it's so important to have equal representation, to have to make sure that we stay in track. Again, I fully agree also with the fact that it is a geopolitical COP. Definitely, we've seen also deals being struck before COP, potentially also during. That, of course, is not in the interest of the majority of the population, and it will not help us to keep below 1.5 degrees.
One of the hot button issues in Baku, at every COP conference, was, of course, climate goal financing.
Yes.
As it all boils down to money. Who needs to pay what to whom and why? My Euronews colleague Jeremy Wilkes just returned from Baku and breaks it all down for us. Take a listen.
The slogan for COP29 is "In Solidarity for a Green World," but we see there's not a great deal of solidarity when it comes to these finance questions. basically, the developed countries are thinking in billions, the developing countries are thinking in trillions, so you've already got a great deal of tension there. And then there's a lot of questions over the kind of finance. Should it be grants, which is what the poorer countries want, or concessional loans, or should it be private finance, which you hear a lot about as well? Who really should be paying for this is a big question. Should China and the Arab states be paying up more because they're a lot richer now than they were in the past? And of course, at COP, you can have a lot of conversations and arguments over shall or should, whether something is obligatory or not. Then there are also taxes that people are talking about, so taxes on aviation, on billionaires, on frequent flyers, on fossil fuel extraction. All of those things could add up to several billion per year. But overarching all of this, the geopolitical tensions which we see in many other political questions between left and right, north and south, all of these different kinds of tensions mean that you get to the situation where you have last-minute brinkmanship and last-minute compromise deals.
Susanna, a lack of solidarity, geopolitical tensions, and brinkmanship. You've nodded while we played this video. What's your take on the financing issue?
Well, first of all, a remark made that it's economists that presented at COP during the first week that indicated the amount needed for developing countries is in the trillions. So the developing countries actually have economic studies that indicate point to the same amount. And that is because we've already entered the adaptation age, as well as we have to fast forward mitigation. So actually, this amount will only increase. And I think the right response is actually for developed countries. And your colleague rightly pointed out that at this COP, there is a big question mark as to who should pay for what, not just because of economic growth, but also because of the total amount of cumulative emissions. So indeed, we found out from studies that now China, in terms of its cumulative emissions, is no longer in the category that it was in 1992 when the UNFCCC Convention was set up. And it is now on an equal level with the industrialized countries of the West when you take into account historical emissions. So this is a little bit what determines who pays for what, the historical contribution as well. And so this is what your colleague was referring to. This COP has brought it all to the forefront. And we've seen that also the European Union would indeed like other countries to step up their finance commitments towards the countries that are sort of on the forefront of the adaptation crisis right now.
Yeah, Francesca, if in an ideal world, we would have a meaningful and sustainable finance plan, but we don't right now. How do we get out of this situation? Because obviously the clock is ticking.
Yeah, so what we really have to see at this time that climate finance commitments go towards farmers, because so they can restore our soils, they can create natural carbon sinks. Because actually, did you know that 1/3 of the world's food production is produced by smallholder farmers, but they only receive 1% of the climate finance? So this is such a small number. And now we're talking about billions or even trillions dollars for climate finance. And if only 10% of that would go to restoring soils, to farmers, we could have a big turnaround in 8 to 10 years. So these are facts that are very important, and we have to push this forward. So
there was an open letter, you've heard about it, that circulated at the conference, signed, among others, by high-profile UN personalities, of course, arguing that countries that do not support the climate transition away from fossil fuel energy must not be allowed to host future COPs. Isn't that a little late after Dubai and Baku, Sam?
Well, again, you need to make sure that to include as many views as possible. Of course, we live in a globalized world, and we need to make sure that inclusiveness is at the center of decision making. Having said that, though, it's important that we keep in line with our ambitions and our aims. We cannot afford simply to go back. I think it was Panama's president, who mentioned that the world currently spends around $2.5 trillion on defense, basically to kill each other, and the funds that developing countries are asking of 1.3 trillion annually is not enough for developed countries. There's also a call for responsibilities from developed nations. But then if we look also back to the EU, we saw that just last week, 13 countries, half of EU member states, were, an infringement procedure was opened against them for not submitting their national energy and climate plans in time. Again, if we take politics as a direction, showing a direction, this is not what's happening.
Politics is a good a keyword. So the president of Argentina, Milei, right wing, visited Donald Trump in Florida, and then the next day he recalled Argentina's negotiating team from the conference. So is Trump's dislike of international agreements on climate already contagious, Franziska?
Yeah, what I see is that it is important that we have different opinions at COP. And we have stakeholders pushing forward nature-based solutions and people doing incredible work in that area. And looking into what is happening, like, it's just important that we have different opinions.
Well, different opinions, I'm happy with that.
Yes.
But if the one opinion is no cooperation and no progress at all, that's not an opinion. That you negate the entire process, right?
Yeah, so I do think this was a situation of early signaling of a possible dynamic to unfold and to be strengthened in the future. However, we don't know for sure that the recalling of the team from COP was actually a result of this meeting. Having said that, I want to come back to the previous point, which is that it's not in our interest for COP to stop being relevant. And also you asked the question, two fossil fuel countries where the economies are heavily dependent on fossil fuels have been hosting the COP.
Yeah.
But let's not forget that the language on phasing out comes from the previous one. And so actually...
Susanna, we're going to talk about fossil fuels in the second round. That's why okay. I want to stop here. And I thank you for this first round. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, are fossil fuels making a comeback? Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Brussels, my love. Our guests are still Susanna Karp, Franziska Heckel, and Sam Williams. More and more politicians are openly questioning the policy priority of the green transition in Europe and elsewhere. At the beginning of the conference, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban paid mere lip service to the green transition by emphasizing that we must also preserve natural gas and oil. He said, and I quote, "We must continue advancing the green transition while also maintaining our use of natural gas, oil and nuclear energy. We cannot sacrifice our industry or agriculture in the process." Franziska, is that really possible and necessary? And is that opinion gaining more and more ground in Europe and beyond?
Yes. So what we've seen that reducing fossil fuels takes time. We need innovations in order to phase out completely out of fossil fuels. At the moment, it is not possible just like that. So it is very crucial that, as said, by reducing fossil fuels, we also have to see that we restore soil and the ground. Because actually, with restoring soil worldwide, we could have 27% of the climate issues solved with regards to the under 2-degree target. So this is something which is a very important and huge number. So I definitely call for restoring soils, at the same time trying to reduce fossil fuels. That, of course, is important, but we should also see into other solutions.
Yeah.
Not just look at fossil fuels.
I mean, in politics, when you set a date in the future and said this is where we need to stop fossil fuels, and then you come back and saying, we might need it a little longer. What's the purpose then?
Again,
Sam?
it's about market certainty, right? We cannot afford to go back to an over-reliance on fossil fuels. Depending on the demand that will be foreseen or the different foresights that we look at, we know that we have enough proven reserves of gas for the next 50, 60 years, more or less. Gas is needed currently to levelize a bit the intermittent nature of renewable energies that we need to now focus on. But from that to going back to over-rely on drilling on countries that are not, as we've seen ourselves in Europe, reliable for energy security is not the valid choice to take. The future is green. and the present is green. We need to focus on clean tech development, on renewable energy deployment, and we need to do that urgently.
Yeah. Were these ambitions too ambitious?
Well, certainly not too ambitious. The question is really if they're not too little too late. And I want to explain what I mean by that, and allow me, Sam, to disagree with you just very briefly there. I don't think we need natural gas to balance the intermittency of renewables. We do have clean technology solutions in that field, which are just waiting to be scaled up. However, the thing that nobody is saying is that fossil fuels are incredibly expensive. And so actually, what we are being told by Prime Minister Orban is that the transition should be much more expensive than it could be. And with that, I disagree with him, because effectively by us wasting money into the fossil fuel industry, well, this is money that is actually coming from, it's public money, right? So it's subsidies to fossil fuels, so they come from European citizens. Wouldn't this money be much better served if actually repurposed and redirected towards the solutions that do ensure not only a net zero future, but also much cheaper electricity bills? And actually, we've seen that what the renewable revolution does is it even yields negative prices on electricity, which means there's a point in time where electricity basically becomes free. So why not go in that direction?
One of the big friends of Viktor Orban is Donald Trump. And he has already said he wants to continue drilling, etc., etc. How will this shape the situation in Europe? Are we on the defensive immediately once Trump takes over, or once? Sam?
We need to go back to, we cannot afford to go back on our decisions. There's, once a decision is set, once we have set aims, we need to continue going for those. How will that affect Europe? It's going to be harder, definitely, but we still have our goals, we still have our targets, and we need to develop on them.
Part of the traditional energy mix is also nuclear energy. Some countries have dropped it altogether, like Germany under Angela Merkel, even though the current Christian Democratic leader Friedrich Merz wants to repeal that decision. Is nuclear energy here to stay as well? Absolutely yes, told us the top representative of the European nuclear industry. Not surprisingly, here he is.
The challenge is so massive to get to net zero in 2050 that you cannot really afford to oppose one technology against each other. Over the past weeks, we've seen many coal plants being reopened in Eastern Europe, including Germany, because simply there was no wind, no sun. And it showed that nuclear is needed as part of the solution to ensure this security of supply that modern economies like ours need, and it will need over the time.
Yeah, is it reasonable to keep the long unloved nuclear energy for the time being, or for a considerable time? Does he have a point here?
For reducing fossil fuels, we have to see how we're able to make it. And if we have nuclear energy and that, we just really have to focus on our tangible targets, as we also talked before about. So what can we do right now in order to have improvement right away? And what source can do, we have Safe Soil calling for a policy brief for the UNFCCC. And this brief is looking into how to bring finance to the farmers, and this is very important. The brief has been signed by 87 nations in cooperations with our partners SECAM and 4/1000, and I think this is very crucial that we also redirect finance in that way and not just look into energy, nuclear or fossil fuels.
Yeah. Susanna, what's your take on nuclear?
So first of all, existing nuclear should absolutely continue. I think this is at this stage as we're trying to rapidly move away from fossil fuels because, as I said earlier, we've actually done too little too late. Now we are actually needing to compensate for the time lost. The question is really, so nuclear, as we know, does not have greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, it is compatible with a net zero accounting, let's say, on emissions. However, I think there are other questions. For example, the cost. right? And so I think each government is then responsible for analyzing the cost of new nuclear.
That is a good point here that concludes this conversation. Thank you to our panel, and stay with us here on Euronews. Welcome back to Brussels, my love. Our guests are still Franziska Heckel, Sam Williams, and Susanna Karp. Until recently, electric cars were seen as the undisputed future of the transportation sector. However, the automotive industry is now plagued by growing concerns about falling demand and the risk of political uncertainty disrupting market conditions and supply chains. The latest figures show that sales of e-vehicles are steadily declining, and the EU ban on the sale of cars with combustion engines from 2035 on is increasingly being called into question by far-right politicians and others. So, between ambitious climate targets, political resistance, and declining expectations, what does the future of the car market look like?
Me personally, I would definitely want to see cleaner transportation and clean air in cities all around the world and less pollution. So that's definitely needed. There's been actually a new technology in development. It's still in the development phase, where the batteries of the EVs don't use cobalt and nickel, because these are two resources that are used for the batteries and have very severe ethical issues, as well as the while mining, what they put into the environment is very severe.
Right now, the market is in trouble. Car makers are in trouble.
The market is in trouble, and I see three main issues here. The first one is infrastructure. Just as much we need to focus on infrastructure when it comes to energy system, to grids. The same is for electric vehicles. Consumers are complaining that the recharging infrastructure is simply not there. Second, you have a lot of Chinese competition, of course, coming into the EU markets. There's a very good photo that can represent this of the port of Antwerp, with thousands of Chinese electric vehicles sitting there for months. And then, last point, you have a lack of carrots, of an incentive from the EU to focus on battery productions, but also on electric vehicles overall. That needs to be addressed if we want to do it. We cannot focus solely on stickism, so putting, for example, a tariff on Chinese vehicles. We also need to really focus on financing that part of distributing and deploying electric vehicles.
Yeah. The overarching question, of course, is why are electric cars not more popular in Europe, and why have they hit a ceiling at 12% or something market share? We've asked a top expert in industrial strategy and trade policy. Here's what he told us.
There is no natural consumer demand for electric vehicles. Okay, last year, loads of subsidies from the member states dried up, and now what we see is consumer demand plummeting. It's absolutely natural, because these products are vastly inferior to internal combustion engines. They are 5 times the cost for 5 times less the range. People just aren't interested in buying them if there are no subsidies available. The only companies who managed to get the manufacturing costs down were the Chinese companies.
Electric cars are bad. Nobody wants them without subsidies. Is that the brutal truth?
Absolutely not. And what do I mean by that? Just hearing the fact that the cost discrepancy is, sort of 5 times over, just shows that different categories of cars are being compared, right? So you're comparing right now the luxury EV with a regular ICE, let's say, like a traditional car, whereas in fact you have to compare the cheapest EV with the cheapest car that uses a conventional internal combustion engine, and then you will see something very interesting, which is that we're rapidly going towards cost parity. Cost parity has already been reached in China, and it's projected to be reached in 2027 in the European Union. And so that could also explain why there's decrease in demand. So it's not that everything is plummeting, it's just that because the demand has been surging in the previous years, indeed with the slowdown
because of the subsidies.
Because of the subsidies, but when cost parity will be reached, we will see demand surging again. And so right now there's a moment in between, and of course declarations from politicians that give citizens the wrong impression that we can afford to walk back on the energy transition are not helpful, because what they're doing is they're pushing citizens to the point where in 2027, once, let's say, the carbon market enters into force, also covering the transport sector, they actually have to pay for that as well. So it would be much better if these citizens, these politicians, the far-right ones making these statements would be responsible and explain that we cannot economically afford to go back on the commitments made, and that it's actually in the government's interest to support the citizens towards making these cleaner choices for their own
Isn't that
benefit.
exactly the adding to that insecurity that consumers are now stalling, and they say, I want a new car, but I have to wait maybe another year or a year and a half to wait where this is going, right? And you said the lack of appropriate charging infrastructure. I think 75% or something of charging stations in Europe are in 3 countries, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. Franziska, what's your take on this? I mean, how can, obviously there's a lot of work of convincing to do, to tell people that this is a good thing, buying an electric vehicle.
I think in the end we have to be realistic about what EVs are, because they're not the big fix for our climate. So they're not addressing ecological well-being. So we have to look at the solutions that can actually fix something right now. And this is also restoring soils as well as reducing fossil fuels. So I would not go into deep of the electric cars and non-electric cars. It is not the solution which will help us completely.
Interesting, Sam. Do you agree with that?
Well, there is in general no big fix, I think, to the problem of global warming, but we need to address it. And electric vehicles is definitely a better option than fossil fuels. So when we go up to the 2035 ban, for example, going back on that, that gives a massive wrong statement. It gives a wrong message again. Why? Because there are investors that put money towards there, and there is willing from the business level to some extent also to do that, to deliver on those promises. So that does not help. Plus, you need incentives and not solely subsidies.
Okay, no big fix. I get the point here, and there's so many questions that we still need to answer. Wonderful conversation here. We're at the end of Brussels, my love. Thank you to our panel and to our viewers at home. If you want to continue the conversation on any topic, write to brusselsmylove@euronews.com or contact us on social media. That's it for today. I'm Stefan Grobe. Have an excellent week. Take care and see you soon.